I think as I sort of started to untangle my family's history, it just became ever more present that that was true. I think sort of, I feel like as children, you sort of take your family just as a fact, who they are, where you're growing up, what your family dynamics are like, and, as sort of like the singular truth that you're aware of. And then I think as I met family members in Taiwan, just the Taiwan family members ended up making the final film, but I filmed with family in Toronto, Los Angeles, and even Guangdong in China. And and then as I spoke with them and heard more of our family stories, and then pieced together the archival, and then also found, my aunt sent me this survivor letter. It really, I guess I could see how my parents' history and my grandparents' history led to who we all were today, who me and my brother were and became. And so I feel like that's really how I understood those things to be true.
That segues really nicely into another one of my questions around language. I translated my grandma's autobiography that was written to a family friend through a series of emails. And I feel like such a common experience that like we as children of the people who lived through the communist revolution have is that we get like bits and pieces of that history. And I translated all of these emails and I like printed them out and bound them and gave them to my parents as a Christmas gift. And I found it really hard to talk to them about this history because of the language barrier that we have. Like they can speak enough of English and I can speak enough of Chinese that we have a relationship and can communicate about everyday things, but they can't really have the kind of conversation that you and I are having about this. So I'm curious, like, what was your experience working with a language barrier with your parents, not just around like the historical aspect, but also like the emotional too, like talking to your parents about mental health, for example?
I love that you did that. I feel like whatever I have, you also have, that you turned it into a bound book and gave it to your parents. So did your grandmother write those at the end of her life, or was it something she was always writing? And she wrote them all to a friend who sent them to you, a former student who sent. And then did you talk about it with your parents after?
Not really. Yeah.
They were just like, thank you?
Yeah, they were just like, yeah, thanks. Well, my parents, sorry. So this family friend sent it to my parents, like after my grandma had passed away, years after. And my mom told me like, hey, these emails exist. And they're like detailing, your grandma has detailed her whole life. And then my mom just like sent all of the emails to me and I was like, well, I don't know what to do with this. It was all in Chinese too, so I couldn't read it. And I literally used Google Translate. So, yeah.
Okay, afterwards, I would love to ask you more about what was in them. The language barrier, it's, that's always been a challenge. And I thought so much of my relationship dynamic with my parents and my brother's dynamic with them was because of language. And until I met my cousin when I was in university, and I realized he had the exact same dynamic with his dad, my uncle. And, they were both born and raised in Taiwan. spoke the same language, but they didn't speak to each other. And so that was my first clue that, like, okay, it's not just a language barrier issue. And yeah, and then, so, right, what is that thing? It became this thing that I was chasing and trying to define and untangle. And of course there's, and what I guess I mean by emotional barrier is, like sometimes I wondered why my father, for example, would forget this really difficult conversation that my brother had. It was all I could think about for like the next several years of my life. And then he forgot, and then didn't talk about it for a long time. And then when I asked, didn't remember. And that, I don't know if it was forgetting as sort of like a mechanism of survival, or because the emotions were so intense that they were sort of lost. But yeah, I think of that as like, what do we express emotionally? Do we share that with each other? What are we willing to feel and not feel? Is also a big question.
Yeah, I definitely have that question too, and it seems to be like two very different coping mechanisms that people have. Like, you either choose to try to understand this trauma, or you choose to try to erase it. And one of the most striking scenes for me in the film was when you were listening to your uncle recount the abuse that he experienced from your grandma in front of her. And when you asked her if she remembers the story that he was telling, she was just like, I wasn't really listening. And so I feel like that it was such a stark moment where you see someone actively trying not to forget and not to confront, or to forget and not to confront. And so I'm wondering, what does it mean for you to be the member of your family that's like doing the work of excavating the history and the pain that people have gone through? Is it connected to like what made you want to become a filmmaker?
Yeah, that scene is really interesting because you might think you can't say these things in front of each other, or, oh my gosh, we're about to talk about these things that feel unspeakable in front of each other. But actually it was not it was very easy for my uncle to tell these stories. And even watching it today, I don't know, I feel like I feel like he was responding to her interruption. And then later that day, my uncle leaves, and actually that's when my grandma recounts the story of being a little girl growing up in Kajar and as sort of a Hakka girl, and that she got an education, and that how rare that was and how hard that was. And I don't know, sometimes I think like maybe that was her answer to his like accusations. And so that was kind of like, I was just piecing and feeling these things. I don't know, right? And I'm sort of just trying to create the narrative for myself, but that's what it felt like. So in a way I interpret it as them speaking to each other. But then there's another part.
Yeah, just like how doing this work of remembering is part of being a filmmaker. Like, if that's the way that you see your job, like your craft. It's a really good question. I feel like I was so emotionally driven. I don't know, like
consciously if I thought I must remember, I must archive, and I must collect photos and create narrative. I just knew like talking to them, visiting them, filming with them was just like feeding something very, very, something that I needed. And receiving the survivor letter was a very emotional experience. Like I felt like totally unmoored, just like lost because of this letter. And so, I don't know, I feel like the filmmaking process gave me the time to just like play with all the pieces, work with like a full creative team. I worked with an editor, so many translators, which made the language barrier like, you know, possible, or I was able to get over that and in my own way sort of make sense of things and create this narrative.
Speaking of narratives, as you already know, I work as a therapist, so I spend a lot of time thinking about trauma. And one of the narratives that I personally am very tired of is like, my parents treated me this way. They were like tiger parents, and they made me like this overperforming overachiever model minority. And I feel like what's really precious to me about your film is that you have such an incisive eye when it comes to identifying like what happened and like who was involved, but you never point the finger and blame anyone for the pain that people go through. You were able to make a film that holds so much emotional complexity, and you see how trauma is passed between people, but the film is able to hold so many people's different truths. And I'm curious if you can say more about who the filmmakers and storytellers and creatives were that inspired you to be able to create this kind of narrative that can hold such complexity.
I feel like there was a period where I was like very bitter and angry, and it was very difficult, I think, specifically when I was like remembering and coming to terms with just the physical abuse that we had growing up. And I was working with a therapist like throughout this film, and I still see her, and we were just talking, but those feelings were very conscious, and for that period of time, like I was very upset. But I feel like I just wanted to listen. So I just wanted to hit record and then just let my family speak. And I was like, okay, if I can't get straight answers, like let's just roll and talk and I think in that way I learned so much more than I could have just coming in and being upset and demanding answers, or and anyway, I think through that process, like I understood so much of where they came from, and like culturally, the misogyny, the physical abuse, that's kind of that line, like something else is being replayed. I was just like, this comes from before you and before my grandparents. And I don't know, it sort of separated their actions from, I don't know, like just blaming them essentially, because of who they were and the choices they made. I was just like, okay, there's other things that are happening here, And then, in terms of like the other writers, and so I actually, didn't know my family was in the re-education labor camps, literally until I watched the film Dead Souls by Wong Bing, which is really 8 hours of these testimonies of survivors of the re-education labor camps. And I was like, the way they talk, because at that point I'd been filming my grandmother for a while. I was just like, it feels the same. And then I asked my dad, and then my dad asked his oldest sister, and then she mailed the letter. And so that, of course, was like hugely transformative. And then I'm very inspired also by Ocean Vuong, who we quote in the beginning. And I feel like, I don't know, there's like a beautiful melancholy to his writing, even though it's very painful. His family were survivors of the Vietnam War. And yeah.
Yeah, love Ocean Vuong. I'm sure many of us do. Yeah, another question I have is around gender and patriarchy. It seems to be like ever present throughout, from your family book only recording male lineage to the disproportionate abuse that the female members of your family endured. What was it like for you to like sort through the tangible evidence of like patriarchal values in your family, and also how has being a queer person informed the way that you see that?
Yeah, I feel like exactly like you're saying, the family book only records male lineages, so women are either born or married in, but they don't have their own square, for example. And there is no lineage beyond them. Again, I think that was one of those things. I was like, these are not the personal choices that these like personal, conscious, individual choices my mom and my grandmother are making. This is like codified. This precedes them for hundreds of years. I feel like the book was just so emblematic of that, and of that deep recognition that, okay, this like misogyny is beyond the individuals within our family and the choices we're making. Was there some queerness? Yeah, so even though being queer and coming out to my parents in particular was difficult, or coming out to my mom, I do feel I could just shed everything, and in that way, it was also very freeing and liberating. I could just like completely, break their expectations. And so, yeah, at that point I was sort of free to do whatever, let alone be constrained by their expectations of who I should be as a woman or something.
Yeah, queerness will do that. I'll ask one more question and then I'll open it up to the audience. I'm curious about how your relationships with your family members has changed since the making of this film, if at all. And I'm also curious if you've shown it to them, and if so, what their reactions have been.
Yeah, definitely have shown it to them. Before we finished the film, everyone watched it and gave their input, and that was probably one of the hardest parts of making this. My mom and my brother had very strong emotional reactions, and which is absolutely fair. They're like very huge characters in the film, and their like most vulnerable moments are like big scenes. And so my brother, it was hard for him, I think, for his like essentially his most painful moment to be like a crux, like a plot point in the film, which I absolutely understand. And his one ask was that the film, for his name not to appear in credits and for his name not to be associated with the film. But at the same time, he also felt it was a really great film. And he's like both, and he's excited to hear it being programmed and that people are responding to it. And our relationship is probably the best it's ever been. So I think it's kind of beautiful, like that we could like tussle so intensely and so vulnerably with each other and come out the other side. I think that's really what it was all about, is like you were saying before, how do you how do you put all these difficult, complex, opposing truths next to each other? It's just very painful, and then you're both still standing there and you're still next to each other, and that's how it happens. And I honestly think like there's a lot of love in that, and that everyone's willing to do that and be with each other. And hold each other's truths, because as much as I'm trying to hold my mom's, she's also holding mine by being in this film. And I think that's like, huge acts of love by everyone is happening. My mom also was like embarrassed, I think, about my grandma's gambling, just like certain thing. That's the thing. It wasn't such a straightforward conversation. She was like embarrassed about that point, and then was talking about that, like, she wasn't a gambler. She just liked to play mahjong. Like, what's the big deal? Everyone plays mahjong. And then I was like, well, remember, like, Auntie told the story, like, she gave birth. She wouldn't leave for her hand when her water broke. And I was like, that's intense. And she was like, fine. She's like, she can't see your film anyway. And then I was like, and then I could talk a lot about it. Everyone, and then my cousin, actually, we had a more political scene in the film because he grew up during White Terror in Taiwan, as all my family did. And he knew what it was growing up in Taiwan, where they only learned about geography in China. You weren't allowed to speak Taiwanese. You only spoke Mandarin. And they talk about how you couldn't throw parties, you couldn't dance, you couldn't publish a magazine. And anyway, they grew up during that time period. But then actually, so he's in a band in Taiwan, and because the political tensions are difficult right now, he asked for that scene to be removed. Yeah, which is kind of a bummer because I really think it's such an important part of the film, but yeah, we took it up.
Thank you for all of your thoughtful answers. Does anyone in the audience have a question they want to ask?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It was a graduation gift from my mom's oldest sister to send me to Taiwan. And so I went for 5 weeks. I visited family in Taipei and then also in Guangdong, China, southern China. And it was, and then that was like the first time I met my cousin, Doopy. And and we like instantly clicked over music, and he took me out all over the city. He's like really big on nightlife. So we like went to bars, restaurant. Anyway, we hung out with his friends, and it was a really good time. And then I just kept going back. I don't know. I think people, like other people in the audience, probably you've experienced this, like people would sort of, I don't know, it's both your home and like the best way I could express it was kind of like, it's like looking into a strange new mirror. And then so I just kept, I just kept wanting to go back. And then I had family there, and then I wanted to keep seeing them. And then...
Hi. Oh, that's very loud. This film was very emotional, I think, for me too. But something I really resonated with and I was curious about is you have moments where music is really integral to, I think, possibly healing or like reconnecting. And I'm just curious about how, if you recognize those moments and, or how that came about where you decided that these were integral moments to put into the film. At the end with the moon represents my heart and all of those, but also karaokeing prior to that, or even doing the class at Crunch. So all of these moments I thought were actually very important moments. So yeah, that's what I was just curious about.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like once I went to college, my mom started singing and dancing, and we would like hear about it through like family texts. And then I think a cousin was visiting from Taiwan, and then so we went to one of her karaoke dancing club events. And she was easily like the best dancer, like had the most beautiful voice. Men were hitting on her, like men who were too old, because it's actually for senior citizens, and she was 60 when she started going, and yeah, the men were like 70. But and I was like, oh, she's like radiant, and I think that always stayed with me. And I was like, important for me to film her in those moments. I also feel like, I don't know, she does have a lot of love inside of her. And so you really see it when she sings and when she dances. And the last song. And then I guess I wanted to join her for that. Like I wanted to literally do it with her. And and then we ended up using it as the last scene. I wanted to join her world, I guess, like do it with her and do what makes her so happy.
Okay, thank you all so much for your questions. That's the end of the Q&A. Thank you so much, Vicky.